Raise your hand if you were born before the 1970s. If your hand is up, you lived during Jim Crow. However, Jim Crow laws only ended in theory. The thin blue line. After a century of people escaping from slavery, South Carolina came up with the idea for slave patrols, and this little mind virus of an idea spread quickly throughout the colonies. Slave patrols were armed posses of white men who monitored local slave populations. They made sure obedience to their sick, twisted system was absolute. They searched out escaped slaves and returned them to their owners. They terrorized the local populace into submission with constant threat of violence. They patrolled rivers. They patrolled roads. They formed a network of discipline for the slaves. It was a racial vigilante system outside the bounds of law for slaves that broke plantation rules. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, these patrols and the military evolved and merged and infused into the police forces and local sheriffs and deputies who kept the peace with the long double-barreled arm of the law by stopping slave revolts and returning the property to the slave owner after it escaped. Law enforcement has always been fully in charge of enforcing segregation. By the 1880s, all major U.S. cities had police forces, many made up of returned Confederate officers and soldiers who were welcomed back into the United States after the Confederacy ended in 1865. The South cannot rise again because it never fell in the first place. This reign of terror was exposed for all to see in the televised events of the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, when 100 U.S. cities burned after the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was seen in the 1990s when the police beat Rodney King and Los Angeles burned. It was seen again when George Floyd had his life snuffed out. White people make up 3/4 of the population of the United States, but they are only 1/2 the victims who have died at the hands of police. Only 1/8 of the population is black. 1/16 if you count only black males, yet they are 1/3 of the deaths by police. If you want to save the white victims, then you have to save the black ones first. And as soon as we do, we will all have freedom from police brutality. Emmett Till was not the exception. His death is a common death for black people. June 7th, 1998, Jasper, Texas. James Byrd Jr. was a 49-year-old black American who had his ankles chained to a pickup truck, and he was dragged for 3 miles down an asphalt road by 2 white men. He died about halfway through. His body hit the edge of a culvert and took off his head and his right arm. They dumped his body in front of a black cemetery. Those were the first white men to be sentenced to death for killing a black person in the history of modern Texas. February 26, 2012. Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old boy, was murdered by a racist Karen with a gun who was in a neighborhood watch for a community where Trayvon, like Emmett Till, was visiting his family. His killer continues to profit from his murder today. November 22, 2014. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy, was killed while playing in a park by a white police officer after a 911 caller reported a juvenile with a fake gun was pointing it at people. The police officer, who'd been officially deemed an emotionally unstable recruit and unfit for duty, shot Tamir twice with no warning within seconds of arriving at the park. The death was considered justified and reasonable and the police officer was placed on paid leave, never indicted, and was allowed to resign. July 17, 2014. Eric Garner died in the New York City borough of Staten Island after a New York City police officer put him in an illegal chokehold while arresting him for suspicion of not paying the tax on a single loose cigarette. Multiple officers piled on top of his back while Eric Garner repeated the words, "I can't breathe," 11 times until he died. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. The officer who choked Garner was not indicted, and it took 5 years to fire him. The man who filmed the killing of Eric Garner was harassed, arrested, and jailed for 5 years. Eric was killed for the suspicion of not paying the tax on a single loose cigarette. July 13th, 2015. Sandra Bland was a 28-year-old African-American woman who was found hanged in a jail cell in Waller County, Texas. A white police officer pulled Sandra over for not using her turn signal to change lanes 3 days earlier. She did not show him the respect he demanded from her, and he dragged her out of her car at taser point. He then pulled her out of the dash cam range and assaulted her and arrested her. Her death was ruled a suicide. July 6th, 2016. Philando Castile, a 22-year-old black man, was fatally shot during a traffic stop by a police officer from St. Anthony, Minnesota. He was shot 7 times at point-blank range in front of his children after being asked for identification. This was live-streamed on the internet. The officer was acquitted of a manslaughter charge. August 30th, 2019. Elijah McClain. Elijah McClain was a 23-year-old unarmed American who died after walking down a sidewalk, carrying groceries and listening to music, when a group of white police officers grabbed Elijah with no provocation, handcuffed him, and held him on the ground for 15 minutes, where paramedics executed him by lethal injection. While his arms were handcuffed behind his back and he was pinned to the ground, they threatened Elijah with a police dog. Then they purposely applied a chokehold to cut off the blood to his brain in order to render him unconscious so they could give him the injection easier. The officers reported to the paramedics that Elijah had attacked them with, quote, "incredible, crazy strength," while the coroner reported he was 5'6" and weighed 140 pounds. While choked unconscious and handcuffed by white police on the side of a dirty road, paramedics injected a lethal dose of ketamine into Elijah's body. While they carted his unconscious body to a nearby hospital, he went into cardiac arrest. Later that night, Elijah was pronounced brain dead, and 3 days later, he was removed from life support. Elijah McClain repeatedly told the officers, "I can't breathe." Elijah vomited multiple times, and he apologized to his killers about it with these words, "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to do that. I can't breathe correctly." Elijah said his very last words with the taste of his vomit in his mouth as police officers laid across his handcuffed arms. "I can't breathe. I have my ID right here. My name is Elijah McClain. That's my house. I was just going home. I'm an introvert. I'm just different. That's all. I'm so sorry. I have no gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting. Why are you attacking me? I don't even kill flies. I don't eat meat. But I don't judge people. I don't judge people who do eat meat. All I was trying to do was become better. I will do it. I will do anything. Sacrifice my identity. I'll do it. You are all phenomenal. You are beautiful, and I love you. Try to forgive me. I'm a good Gemini. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Ow! That really hurt. You are all very strong. Teamwork makes the dream work. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to do that. I just can't breathe correctly. The district attorney determined that none of the officers committed any criminal acts, and no charges were filed against them. 6 months later, the Aurora city manager said that the force applied during the encounter was consistent with training. 4 months after that, photos of these police officers surfaced, showing them near the site where they killed Elijah, reenacting the chokehold they used on him. And while executing an American citizen without charges is consistent with training, bringing a little shame upon the honor of the department by lifting the mask and showing Jim Crow's real face is not. And so the police chief fired 4 officers with these words: October 12th, 2019. Natashiana Jefferson, a 28-year-old black American, was fatally shot through a closed window in her home by a police officer in Fort Worth, Texas, because her front door was open at night. As soon as Natashiana came to the window to see what was going on outside her home, the officer immediately fired at the reflection of his flashlight in the glass, killing her in front of her 8-year-old nephew that she'd been playing video games with at the time. February 2020. Ahmed Alybi was a 25-year-old unarmed black man. He was fatally shot while jogging. He was chased down by a pickup truck being driven by a law enforcement officer born in the Jim Crow era, who was armed with a .357 Magnum. His 34-year-old son was riding in the back of the pickup truck with a shotgun. Another man in a second car boxed Ahmed Alybi in and trapped him on the road like a dog and began videotaping. The son shot Ahmed dead in the street a few seconds later. 4 different prosecutors refused to prosecute these killers, and the murderers were not arrested for 2.5 months after the video of Ahmed's death went viral. March 2020. Brianna Taylor, a 22-year-old EMT, was fatally shot by 3 plainclothes Louisville, Kentucky police officers who were not wearing body cams. They broke into her apartment at midnight while she slept in her bed and shot 20 rounds at her, killing her. 1 officer was fired months later. No one has been charged in her murder. May 2020. George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, when a white police officer knelt on his neck for 9 minutes while Floyd was handcuffed, face down, and had other officers laying on his body. He begged for his life. He cried out for his mother, and he repeatedly stated, "I can't breathe." In the last 2 minutes of the ordeal, he lay motionless with no pulse. The entire time, onlookers begged the police to get off of Floyd's neck. It took months of riots and protests and burning cities to even get the officers arrested.